Thank you, Pete. This presentation today I just called Drought Survival 101, and my objectives are primarily fourfold: define and understand the importance of drought in rangeland ecosystems, to discuss how a grazing plan can be modified through the year in response to changing conditions, evaluate precipitation patterns and discuss how that knowledge can be used to predict and plan for drought, and then discuss the important factors to consider in developing a drought management plan, and discuss proven strategies to predict and deal with that might be applicable in other people's situations. If you look at the drought monitor, I'm not sure what it's been like all over the state, but up here in the Panhandle, the last 6 weeks we've had really pretty good rainfall. But if you look at that drought monitor, we're in somewhere between a severe and an exceptional drought over much of the state. And this is a result of the fact that, one rain does not a drought break or make. And so what's happened before determines what can happen now. And if we look at rainfall patterns for the state, and I know this is a busy slide, but I figured that a lot of people may want to come back to this and get some of this information, so I tried to make it as complete as possible. But there's several things to look at in this little table. One is that median rainfall, which is if you take all of the values and rank them from top to bottom, that's the middle value. And in every instance, for every single month of the year, median rainfall is always less than average. And so if a guy wanted to make some money, if you could get somebody to give you a standing bet and take the side that said we're going to get below average rainfall this month, you're going to collect more times than you're going to pay out. The other thing, as you look, there are certain times of the year. If you look down in these bottom rows here, you'll see that there are some months that are much more predictable than others. And primarily early in the growing season is going to be the best time to expect rain. And once you get past that early part of the growing season, the odds of having higher than normal rainfall drop precipitously. The other thing to look at is in that yellow row there, even with the better than normal rainfall that we've been having, we're still below normal by a considerable margin. We're probably in about the bottom 15% a year so far if you take the last 12 months. And so with that, we can look and we look around and we say, well, we've got a lot of green out there. But because of the mortality on some of the more desirable perennial grasses that we've had, we're probably still not going to have, even with above normal rainfall, we're not going to have a better than normal year for those desirable plants. We may get plenty of forage, but it may not last into next year. If we define drought as an unanticipated shortfall in soil moisture that affects the amount of forage available for livestock, we can't do anything about the moisture that we receive out of the sky, but we can do something about how much of that we get some good out of. If we look at this little diagram from some research that was done in New Mexico, we see that there is a linear response to rainfall, which should be no surprise to many people. But we see that those actual data points are scattered in a cloud around that line. And the reason for that is that not all rainfall is the same. We know that it's affected by what kind of plants we have growing out there. We know that optimum temperatures for warm season and cool season grasses are different. And if we have a plant community that is dominated by one or the other, if we get rainfall outside of that time period, when temperatures are around that optimum, then we're not going to get as much good out of that rain as we normally would. We also know that evapotranspiration losses vary with the type of plant, the temperature that we have at the time, wind velocities at ground level, and the amount of ground cover that we have. The more cover we have on the soil surface, either from living plants or from plant residue, the lower the evaporative losses and the more that we can get to go through those plants. We also know that the amount and intensity of rainfall affects the amount that's absorbed. If we get little bitty showers, under 1/10 of an inch, the amount of good we get out of them is very limited. And likewise, if we get really hard driving rains in large quantities, a lot of that tends to run off, and so we don't get as much good out of that. And then finally, the previous year's conditions affect the maximum potential for production for the current year. We know that the buds for perennial grasses that are going to turn into stems for the coming year were produced last year. So that's the maximum amount that we can expect. And if we have, say, a hot, really cold, dry winter, a lot of those buds are going to die, and so we further decrease the potential. And then if it keeps going dry into the year, we end up with even less and less produced. If we get an above average year after a bad year, we end up with, we may have a lot of foliage that's produced, but we're going to have a high proportion of stem because we have fewer tillers that can be produced, and so we end up with forage quality suffering. And then finally, plant maturity also affects growth rate. If that plant is already shooting up a seed stalk before we get any rain, we're not likely to get a lot more leaf material produced, which is what our bread and butter is in the livestock business. We can see here in this diagram, this is just annual production by month and precipitation by month. And what we can see from this is, again, not all rainfall is the same. This is taken from an ecological site in the Panhandle, but the pattern will be very similar in a lot of parts of the state. Basically, early in the year, when we have moderate temperatures and the plants are less mature, and so they're still producing leaves, we tend to get a lot more production per inch of rainfall. After they start to mature and they start to elevate the growing point and make a seed head, then even with relatively similar rainfall like we see in July and August compared to May and June, we get much, much lower production during those years. And so if we don't have a good year started by, say, the end of June, in this case, our odds of having an average year drop a lot, because not only do we have lower likelihood of above average rainfall, but we also are going to get less good out of the rain that comes. And so one of the critical points in the year that we need to be looking at is these periods, and in this case in the Panhandle it would be somewhere about the end of June. If we don't have a good year started by then, we need to be making some decisions then, not waiting until later and hoping that things will get better. The other thing we know from looking at this diagram is looking at the annual production by month. Not a lot is happening from, say, the end of September until we get up into March or even April. And so if we get to the end or in the mid to late fall, just about frost, and we don't have enough grass to carry us until we can anticipate major growth, say in May, that's another critical time that we can make predictions and be fairly confident to say, well, we need to reduce forage demand in some way. I'm a big collector of quotes, and some things that I think are pertinent to this discussion is, if we don't change direction, soon we'll end up where we're going. And another way of saying that is, if we do what we've always done, we're going to get what we always got. And so if we're looking at being chronically short of forage, it should be telling us that, we're doing something wrong. If we are not if we're not gaining forage out in front of us through the growing season and the grazing season, we probably need to reduce numbers right at that time. Andrew Carnegie said that most people will lose more to indecision than they will to a bad decision. Quite often I've heard many times people say, well, I'm afraid to do anything because it may rain, or I'm afraid that if I sell my cows now, I won't be able to buy back, or whatever. But by and large, mostly what is happening is people are scared to make a decision, so they don't make any. And they end up losing a lot of equity when they would have probably been better off. Even if they make the mistake, they probably won't lose as much money as they would from indecision. Stan Parsons, who was a great mentor of mine, said that in a drought you need to remain in your sphere of control and look at the vegetation and your soils, keep them covered. When you lose sight of that fact, you start to get into problems that are going to take a long time to recover from. And really, what are the things that are in your sphere of control? We can't do anything again about how much rain falls. We can't change what's going on around us. All we can change is us. And that is our response to the situation. For instance, we need to keep adequate plant material on that ground, and the way we do that is by managing livestock numbers and forage demand. We can manage graze periods and recovery periods so that we keep forage demand in line with supply, and we allow those desirable plants to recover from the defoliation that they get. And then I have in question, with a question mark, livestock water. How much do we have in a place? How quick is the recovery? How many animals will a given water source handle? That allows us a lot more flexibility in where and when animals are present. If we've only got very small water troughs with very low recovery, we can't concentrate animals on smaller areas and give bigger areas more chance for regrowth. The other thing we can affect is our attitude. And again, making decisions tends to keep people in a more upbeat frame of mind. If we consider ourselves victims, then we end up going into depression, and we do a lot of things that end up turning out bad. Again, and I keep harping on this, increased ground cover and root material and organic matter in the soil, increased infiltration, they increase retention, and they increase the ability of that soil to give up water to plants. So we can make better use of the rain that we actually get. Longer deferment from grazing allows preferred plants to recover when they're severely defoliated compared to their neighbors. Many people talk about the take half, leave half principle, but the problem is that those animals never did learn to read, and so they don't know they're supposed to take half of all the plants. And they're just like we are when we get to a buffet and there's lots of strawberry shortcake and ice cream on the buffet line. We tend to eat a lot of that, and we leave the boiled cabbage and asparagus alone. They're going to do the same thing. Those preferred plants are the ones that are making our money. We need to give them an ability to recover from those animals being there and defoliating them. If animals are present all the time, they're going to continually go back to those plants. This is just an illustration. You can see even on the left, and this is in sandy ground, even with just a little amount of cover that's there by that pin, we can see that the ground is staying moister under that plant cover than it is just outside of it. And when we start to increase cover even more, like on the right, you can see the very dark soil with good soil moisture underneath the canopy of those grasses, where it's even starting to dry out under a sparser cover, but still with some vegetation on it. Those kind of things can have a huge effect on the amount of good we get out of the rainfall that we receive. If we continually allow that soil to stay bare, we increase the chances for erosion, and you'll hear people talk about pedestaling of plants. Used to be, people thought plants were building the soil, but what's actually happening is just what you see in this picture. Water tends to move the soil off where it's bare and leave soil where it's covered. And so we end up with these plants on little stools, and that's an indication that we're not leaving enough cover. This is just an illustration, and most people will look at this and say, well, this guy is obviously overgrazing, and he is. But he was not overstocked, because most of this pasture had old woolfy plants all over it that had not been utilized at all. But what was happening was they were concentrating down in this alkaline bottom, keeping that ground bare, and so not only did we have more evaporative losses, but in this case we had kind of a double whammy, because these soils were very tight clays with a high salt content, and as that soil bared off, the water that fell dissolved those salts, and then the evaporative losses and the capillary action carried the salts to the surface and made it even more saline, and so they could get less good out of the water. Whereas in this slide, the same ecological site, same types of soils, very close by. This is a grazed pasture, but this guy left enough residue when he got finished, moved out, gave those plants an ability to recover and regrow leaf, kept the soil shaded, kept that evaporative loss low, got more into the ground, and it was a highly productive site. We think a lot about the effects of cover on rainfall infiltration. But quite often, if you're in a part of the state where we get some snow, a lot of times we get a lot of wind with that snow. And sometimes you can capitalize on both your snow and the neighbor's snow, because as it starts to blow across your country, if you've got cover, you catch his snow, his bears off, and you get more good out of it. In this instance, you can see there's about 9 inches of snow behind this tall plant, and there's about 3 inches out in the inner space. Now, according to my calculations, that'd be about 3 times the good that was gotten out of that snow right adjacent to that plant as it would be out in the inner space. Had this producer had that kind of grass cover over most of the pasture, he could have got a lot more good out of his dormant season precipitation. So what is necessary to maintain the adequate cover to increase the effectiveness of your rainfall? The first thing is you've got to have stocking rate right. You need to have it somewhat approximate the capacity of that land to support those animals. We've said this, we've known this for a long time. Stocking rate is the most critical part of grazing management. But in addition to that, you've got to leave the particularly if you are in a grazing management program where you're using several pastures per herd, you've got to leave the pasture while sufficient residual remains. There's a common misconception that if you are using many paddocks per herd, that you graze it down to the dirt and make them eat a lot of things that they wouldn't normally before you move on, and nothing could be further from the truth. That's possible, but it's going to cost you if you do. Not only do you make the animals eat a low quality diet, but you are affecting the effectiveness that you can get out of the rainfall. And then you have to be gone long enough for those plants to recover that were defoliated. They're going to take the good ones too severely most of the time. Fortunately, those plants will do quite well if they're allowed to regrow between defoliations. In any pasture, you're going to have plants that look anywhere from something like on the right to something like on the left, because animals tend to graze selectively. Think about the low spots in your pasture. They tend to be grazed off closely, and they tend to be grazed off closely repeatedly. If we don't move animals out, we're going to end up with root systems that look like that on the right. They are less tolerant of drought. They have a lower capability of competing with their neighbors that may be less palatable, and so you start to have shifts in composition. As the productivity there decreases, animals are going to have to go somewhere else, and so those overutilized portions of a pasture tend to be focal points of degradation that get worse in drought, and they spread kind of like a cancer. And there's nothing we're going to do about that as long as we have animals in the pasture all the time. If we're wondering what the right amount of residual looks like, this obviously ain't it. Now, this was in a pretty degraded resource in the first place. And what's outside the cage is not necessarily indicative of what was around the pasture, because we know animals tend to congregate around an exclosure cage or something and use it a little more heavily. But we can see there's a lot of bare ground. We've destroyed the structure of the surface soil. But even inside the cage, we don't have really the amount that we'd like to see. Whereas in this, and this was just a couple miles away from the previous slide, We have much more outside compared to the last picture. We have more outside versus inside than we did in the previous picture. Much more ground cover, much more leaf area remaining, and so we will get better use of the rainfall. Comparing those two places, we went in and we looked at what was in the cage. That's the production that we have in that second column. We looked at what was outside the cage, so that's the residual. We compared that for percent utilization, and when you look at that first slide, 40% utilization, and that's taken everything into account. What the cattle ate, what the insects and bugs ate, what the wildlife was taken, what was destroyed by weather, everything. So we were well within the take half, leave half at 40% utilization. The higher residual, he was at about a 26% utilization. But what is noteworthy there is he was leaving more in the pasture than the other guy by about twice, or at least half again as much as what the other guy produced in a year. He had roughly 5 times the root growth, and he was running half again as many cattle. Now, when the low residue producer, we had a little field day, he looked and he said, I don't like what I'm seeing. What do I need to change? And we said, well, let's provide some recovery. When you think you need to, when you think you're getting where you need to be, move the cattle to the next pasture. And so he did. And he went from what you were seeing in that first cage picture to something like this. Now look where the hat is in the middle foreground of the picture. That plant right behind it is little blue stem, and there's another little blue stem right behind it. That is the degree of use that he had on a pasture, and then he would move on. And as a result, he started to get a lot more seedling recruitment, decreased the amount of bare ground, started to get more good out of his rainfall, and produce more forage. If you're in somewhere like the Panhandle in shortgrass country, you'll never produce as much as what we saw there. But you can still use some things to tell, am I leaving enough residual? The amount that's required doesn't really change whether you're in a drought or not, so taking half or leaving half of not very much to begin with is not going to work. When you look out across and you see a lot of bare soil, and you see something like this where it looks like it was mowed and all the grass is about the same height, that's probably telling you you've either been there too long or you had too many animals while you were there. Whereas if you're in that short grass country and you have something like this, where it's much less even, you still have almost all of the soil surface covered, and there are some ungrazed plants, you're probably getting a little closer to something that's right. This is a shot taken from the water trough. The post that you see there in the foreground was about 5 feet away from the water trough, looking out into the pasture. This man had 12 paddocks coming into the same water point, but he had, and what you see there is the pasture that he just came out of. And other than that first 30-40 feet right outside the gate, you can still see a lot of residual forage left in the pasture. He's going to be gone for an extended period, allow regrowth, and this was in some really sandy country, and still soils are very stable, well covered, and he's going to get all the good that's possible out of the rain that he gets. A lot of people will say, well, I'm going to feed hay, and that's how I'll be able to keep forage supply in line with forage demand. But there's some things that you need to ask yourself before you make that decision. First, you never know how long this drought is going to last. So how long are you going to continue to feed? And what effect is that going to have both on the resource and on your pocketbook? And then ask yourself, what all is that cow going to eat? If you're feeding, and if that cow's doing okay, if she's still out on pasture and you get some rain and she's got a choice between that nice green, tender, rapidly growing, even if it's only for a short time, palatable species of grass that's growing out there, or some old dry hay, which is she going to eat? And what effect is that going to have on that grazed plant? Then, how is that going to affect the productivity and the effectiveness of the use of the water? Then ask yourself, how much are you making on that cow, even in normal conditions? Oops, I clicked too many times. And then how many calves does the average cow have in her lifetime? And we're fixing to talk about that a little bit more. And based on how many calves that average cow has in her lifetime, how many do you have left to recoup this additional feed that you're putting out to her in a drought? This is a little table that I put together because I would oftentimes ask producers, how many calves does the average cow produce in her lifetime? And I'd get quite, from 7 to 10 calves. And so I thought, well, if you take the percentages, I don't think that's right. And so I just put this together. Now, this is a really rosy case scenario. We have 95% of the cows that are exposed to a bull actually conceive. And then of those that conceive, 95% of those actually wean a calf. And we're not culling for anything out. No bad bags, no cripples, no bad actors, no death loss, no anything else. And even at that, the average cow in her lifetime only produces just over 6 calves. If we keep a heifer out of her to replace her, that leaves you about 5. If you don't have that 95, if you even reduce that to 90, and the statistics will show that the average cow, or the average cattleman is having about an 85% calf crop. But at 90% and 90%, the average cow will produce just about 4 calves in her lifetime. That doesn't leave us much room for additional expenses, particularly if our profit margin is pretty low right now. As you start to feed that cow, the amount that you can expect to recoup out of her gets less and less. Maintaining equity may be much more important than trying to maintain how many cows that you usually run. So I want to leave you with some strategic things to think about to be prepared to survive periodic drought. Remember always that the maximum potential for grass production is determined for the next year by what happens this year. If we have a dry year this year, the odds of having a great year next year are pretty low. because the buds that are going to determine productivity next year are produced this year. Some of those are going to die as a result of bad weather or whatever. And so what we had happen this year is going to largely determine how things, what the possibilities are for next year. Because the percentage of the potential that we produce this year that's actually achieved is determined by what falls next year. Also remember that as that stand starts to open, as the number of desirable plants that you have start to decrease, or the size of those crowns decreases, and you have more open ground in between good grass plants, you're inviting invasion by other undesirable species. A lot of our unpalatable or poisonous weeds, a lot of our brush species will come into these open stands. So we've got to try to take care of those plants even in a drought. Now, will we eliminate any mortality? Absolutely not if we're in a dry period, but we can certainly minimize the problems that we have. Because we know that perennial grasses, as long as they're not defoliated more than twice in a growing season, they will generally do better, particularly if they're given adequate opportunity for regrowth following grazing. By that we mean being allowed to regrow a full complement of leaves between grazing. Also remember that droughts are often broken with a very large precipitation event, so we need to prepare the resource to respond to that big event. If we have the whole place denuded because we tried to keep more cattle than what the place would run, we're going to end up with more runoff, less infiltration, more erosion, and we can end up in a cycle that never ends. Many people can look around and see neighbors who are perennially in a drought, no matter how much it rains. A lot of that is because of the amount of cover that they're leaving out there. So some strategic level, that is very long-term kind of actions that need to be taken, that need to be done. First is you have to plan for long-term water availability. Now there are places that it's just not possible to do anything but have dirt tanks. There's no groundwater available. But if there's groundwater, it will pay to be able to use that, even if you don't use it all the time, and to have adequate size troughs and adequate water going to those troughs for good recovery, so that if need be, you can move animals around and have enough for them to get a drink. Something that we haven't talked about a lot in this, but you need to have your enterprise mix and your production cycle reflect drought risk. If you have a high proportion of years that can be very dry, you need to be concentrating most of your livestock enterprise in liquid classes of livestock that you can turn whenever you need to and still be able to at least get your money back out. From a production cycle standpoint, you need to be, if you're, say, running cows and calves, you need to be calving at a time when you're pretty sure you're going to have plenty of forage for so that they'll breed back quickly. One of the problems with that, if you look at that diagram that we had early in the presentation, where most of the grass growth is in that early spring, and so you want to calve, say, in late spring. That's also one of the critical points of the year where you need to be getting rid of livestock if it's too dry. If you have a bunch of wet navel calves and the only class of livestock you've got is reproductive cows, now you've got to try to figure a way to get those cows marketed at that time with little baby calves on. So you need to have some other class of livestock. Maybe you keep a lot of your heifers. Maybe you keep some steers. Maybe you buy some packer cows and put weight on them through the winter. Whatever you do, you have something that you can say it's time to pull the trigger and we need to get them out of here to somewhere else. And then the greater the ability to subdivide pastures or combine herds of cattle so that you can increase the length of recovery and decrease the graze period is always going to be a good thing. Now, that can be done with temporary fencing. It can be done with permanent subdivision of pastures, but the more pastures that you have and the greater the ability to combine herds, the better you're going to be able to manage during drought. Tactical level decisions, that is, what are you going to do? What's your strategy for the year? Always know which animals you're going to sell if you have to. Know which ones that you want to sell first. No matter the enterprise mix, no matter what kind or class of livestock that you're running, no matter how much you think you can't find animals as good as what you've got, everybody's got a bottom end. Look at the drought maybe as an insurmountable opportunity to get rid of the bottom end of your herd and improve the genetic merit of your livestock. Always be looking at forage demand and the availability of forage, and at the amount of forage that you produce per inch of rainfall, and adjust your plans on a timely basis. Again, those two critical times is right after that rapid growth phase and just before the dormant season. Those are two really critical times. But you need to be looking as you go through the year. One of the advantages that I see from a grazing management program where you are using multiple pastures per herd is that you end up with you end up seeing that you're running out of forage much quicker than you would if you just had them out on a great big pasture and were just kind of looking, because the rate of depletion is much slower and you won't notice it as quickly. If you assume, yeah, I can be in this pasture for whatever, 30 days, and at the end of 2 weeks, the cows are all standing there bawling, waiting to go out the gate, you know that you're overstocked right then, and you can do something about it a lot quicker. And then, in my humble opinion, do not ever drought feed on pasture. If you feel like you have to keep the cattle, and if you feel like you have to feed, you're probably better served to get them up in a pen and feed them there and let those pastures recover. Then on day-to-day operations, know those rainfall patterns, those critical times in the year when the forage grows and when rainfall becomes less predictable. Guys in Las Vegas that make their money gambling don't make their money knowing what every card is going to be that turns up. They know what the odds are and they bet accordingly. You may get a really wet late summer, but that's not the way to bet it. Monitor your growth rates and residual herbage and adjust your stocking rates then, don't wait, and then lengthen your recovery period. Quite often you will have people that are using several pastures per herd and they'll say, well, when it gets dry, I'll move faster. No, you need to move slower. The recovery is much more important than how long the graze period is. If you want to graze for a shorter period, you're going to need more pasture. If you don't have enough even then, you've got too many animals. And then one of the ways to get more pastures per herd is to either combine herds or split a pasture with some temporary fence or something of that nature. As it starts to rain again, before it starts, while you're in that drought, just remember it doesn't take long for a cow to eat her head off. When you're feeding her extra feed that's probably costing you more than it normally would anyhow, you're going to lose equity in that cow. So don't end up with, yeah, you saved the herd and lost the ranch because now you have no equity and nobody will loan you any money. Manage those residue levels. Get the most good out of the rain that you get. And then whenever it starts to rain again, don't automatically go out and go buy more cows or keep way more heifers. Wait until you know you've got the grass to carry them, and then get the animals that amount of grass will carry. That is all I have. I would entertain any questions or comments at this time.
Any questions for Dr. Steffens? Feel free to type them in chat pod and he'll be glad to answer. I see a question coming in, and while the question comes in, let me go ahead and say that here in a little bit you're gonna get a survey. It'll go pop up in your browser. Please take time to complete the survey. The response are anonymous, and the information really helps us. Again, as y'all thinking about questions, or let me kind of throw this in that our next session is going to be resets and Jupiter control, how to treat, and with Dr. Megan Clayton and Dr. Allison McDonald going to be our speakers next time. I forgot the date. The next webinar is going to be the first Thursday of the month, which is going to be on August the 7th. August 7th will be our next webinar, and there's going to be one CEU available for that webinar.